He captured the colonel's daughter for revenge, but soon had to protect her from her own father. The stifling officer's quarters reeked of deceptive tranquility, simmering tension, and impending doom. Lydia traced the delicate veins of a pressed wildflower, her touch gentle, reverent. Outside the fort was a bastion of order of polished brass and the sharp commands of her father's long knives. Inside her world was a prison of needlepoint and silent dinners. But Lydia had a secret. Tucked beneath her mattress was a worn map, its routes to the wild, unknown territories memorized like a prayer for a life she desperately wanted to live. A sudden war cry shattered the afternoon calm, a sound not of her world, a sound of pure, unadulterated vengeance. Her father had promised her safety. He had promised her order. He had lied. The cage door was about to be ripped from its hinges. But what lay outside wasn't the freedom she dreamed of. It was a reckoning. The air in the colonel's quarters was thin and dry, smelling of beeswax, old paper, and the suffocating propriety of a life lived within walls. Lydia lived her life by the precise ticking of her father's mantel clock, a life measured in straight seams, polite nods, and the silent, heavy dinners, where the clinking of silverware was the only conversation. From her window, she could see the vast wild land stretching to the horizon, a place of impossible freedom that called to her like a half-forgotten song. "Order, Lydia," her father, Colonel Archer, had told her just that morning, his voice as starched as his uniform. "Civilization is built on order. We are the wall that holds the chaos at bay." But his order felt like a cage. Her secret rebellion was a worn paper map tucked beneath her mattress, its creases as familiar as the lines on her own palm. She would trace the faded ink rivers and mountain ranges with her finger, whispering their names, the whispering canyons, the sunken mesa, the Eagle's Pass. They were prayers for a world she had only ever dreamed of, a world beyond the dust and discipline of the fort. She longed for the chaos her father so despised. She would soon learn the true meaning of the word. It began with a sound, a single high-pitched cry that tore through the monotonous afternoon calm. It was not the sound of a bugle or a drill sergeant. It was alien, primal, a war cry. Lydia froze her hand, hovering over the map. Another cry joined the first, then another, a chorus of vengeance that seemed to rise from the very earth. Gunshots cracked. Men shouted. The precise ticking of the clock was swallowed by a tidal wave of noise. The world dissolved into chaos. She scrambled from her bed, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She ran to the door, pressing her ear against the thick wood. She could hear the thunder of boots on the parade ground, the splintering of wood, the screams of men. Her father's wall of order was crumbling. "They're over the west wall," a voice shrieked from outside. "To the barracks." Panic seized her. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room that had been her prison. Now it was a trap. She dove under her bed, pulling the thick quilt with her, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The door to her quarters didn't open. It exploded. Wood and iron flew across the room as the door was kicked from its hinges. A figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the hellish orange glow of fires that had started outside. It was a man, but larger than any man she had ever seen, his frame blotting out the light. He was a giant born of the approaching twilight. He stepped inside. He was bare-chested, his skin painted with symbols of black and red, his face a mask of cold, focused fury. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the room, dismissing her porcelain dolls, her books, her entire life in an instant. Then they found her. They locked onto her hiding spot under the bed as if he could see straight through the wood and wool. He moved with a terrifying grace, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He ripped the quilt away. Lydia stared up into the face of the war cry, the face of the land's retribution. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He reached down his hand, closing around her arm. His grip was not intentionally cruel, but it was like being caught in a steel trap. He pulled her from under the bed as if she weighed nothing, her feet scrambling for purchase on the floor. She was dragged out of her room through the chaos of the fort. She saw flashes of the battle, a fallen soldier, his blue coat stained dark, a warrior with a tomahawk raised high, the smoke thick and choking. He pulled her through a breach in the wall and out into the wild, darkening land. The sounds of the battle faded behind them, replaced by the pounding of her own heart and the harsh sound of his breathing. She didn't know how long they ran. Time had shattered along with her father's door. When she next became aware of her surroundings, she was no longer running. She was lying on a soft buffalo robe inside a teepee. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else, a strange herbal scent that was both sharp and sweet. Through the tent's opening she could see the last sliver of a blood-red sunset. Then a shadow fell across the opening and he was there. Honiahaka. He did not enter but stood guard, a silent, unmoving silhouette. The hunt was over. His face, impassive and hard as carved stone, told her everything she needed to know. Her cage had been broken, but she had not found freedom. She had only traded one prison for another. Lydia's new life began with the morning sun. It streamed through the smoke hole of the teepee, a dusty golden spear that illuminated a world of painted leather and sleeping forms. Her gilded cage at the fort, with its polished wood and lace curtains, had been replaced by this one, a circular prison of hide that smelled of smoke, earth, and a people she had been taught to fear. Her guard was a silent, brooding statue. Honiahaka sat by the entrance, his back to her, yet she felt his presence as a physical weight. He had all the warmth and conversational charm of a granite boulder. Her finishing school in Boston had offered many useful lessons on posture and watercolor painting, but had criminally neglected the chapter on what to do when abducted by a vengeful war party. She was an asset, a piece in a game whose rules she did not understand. A bargaining chip with blonde hair. "Come," he grunted later that day, gesturing with his head. She followed him out into the village, and it was here, under the vast, uncaring sky, that the world her father had built began to fray at the edges. She had expected savagery, a chaotic mess of whooping heathens. Instead, she found a quiet, profound sorrow. She saw the faces of the people, the gaunt cheeks of the elders, the wide, hungry eyes of the children. She saw the women mending worn clothes with a patient dignity, their hands never still. This was not the chaotic horde her father spoke of. This was a community holding its breath, waiting for its heart, their imprisoned chief, to be returned. A few days into her captivity, a small commotion drew her attention. A woman was weeping quietly, cradling a small boy whose skin was hot with fever. His breathing a shallow rattling sound. The medicine man had done all he could. Now they could only wait. Lydia watched a knot tightening in her stomach. She recognized the rasping cough, the telltale rash beginning to form on the boy's neck. It was the same scarlet fever that had swept through the fort 2 winters ago. She remembered a book her mother had given her, a dusty tome on herbal remedies. Useless nonsense, her father had called it. But she remembered a passage, willow bark for fever. Hesitantly, she approached Honiahaka. The boy, she began, her voice small. "He has the scarlet sickness. I might know something that can help." He looked down at her. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "A white woman's medicine." It was likely a trick. But then he looked at the weeping mother and at the child, and the hard line of his jaw softened almost imperceptibly. He gave a single curt nod. Guided by her memory, he led her to the riverbank and watched as she gathered the bark from a willow tree. She showed the mother how to boil it into a bitter tea. She did not know if it would work. It was a desperate prayer offered in a foreign tongue. She did not see the child again for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, as Honiahaka led her back from the river, the mother stood waiting. She did not speak. She simply looked at Lydia and then placed a hand over her own heart and bowed her head. Behind her, in the doorway of their lodge, the little boy was sitting up, his fever broken. Honiahaka saw the exchange. He said nothing, but the silence as they walked back to her teepee felt different, lighter. The change, however, was fleeting. Hope is a dangerous thing in a dying land. Later that week, a rider was spotted, a lone warrior approaching from the direction of the fort. The village went still. A council of elders gathered, Honiahaka standing beside them, his face grim. The rider dismounted his horse, lathered in sweat, and from his saddlebag he produced a sealed dispatch bearing the colonel's insignia. Lydia was brought from her teepee to stand before the council to hear the fate her father had chosen for them all. An elder with a face like a dried riverbed broke the seal and read the words, his voice low and steady, translating the cold, sharp English into the flowing sounds of his own language. "The chief of the Cheyenne will be tried for acts of war against the United States Army," he read. His voice did not tremble. "All hostilities must cease. The renegades will release the hostage and surrender their arms unconditionally by the next full moon." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Failure to comply will be met with a swift and final correction. No further negotiations will be entertained." The parchment was not an offer. It was not a treaty. It was a death sentence written on the back of a lie. In that moment, Lydia understood. Her father was not coming for her. He had never intended to. She wasn't a bargaining chip. She was an excuse. The ultimatum was not a secret for long. It spread through the village like a prairie fire, a wind of fear and fury. That night, Lydia was dragged from her teepee and brought before a great council fire. The flames leaped high into the darkness, painting the faces of the warriors in fierce dancing masks of orange and black. She was the center of their rage, a pale-skinned symbol of her father's treachery. A warrior with a face like a hawk's, all sharp angles and burning eyes, spoke in a torrent of guttural words, his hand chopping the air as he pointed at her. She didn't understand the language, but she understood the meaning. Death. He was demanding her death. Then Honiahaka stepped forward. He did not shout. His voice was a low, powerful rumble, the sound of stone grating on stone. He spoke for a long time, his words measured firm. The hawk-faced warrior spat on the ground, but fell silent. Honiahaka had won her a reprieve. Not out of kindness, she knew. Out of strategy. A dead hostage had no value. She was returned to her teepee, the angry whispers of the council following her like hornets. Later, when the moon was high and the village was draped in an uneasy quiet, a small girl slipped through her teepee flap and beckoned for her to follow. The girl led her to a larger lodge at the edge of the village, the home of the chief. Inside, a woman with a face of noble wrinkled parchment sat waiting. Her hair was white, her eyes dark and full of a sad ancient wisdom. It was Tashina, the wife of the imprisoned chief. "Sit," the old woman said, her English soft and accented but clear. Lydia obeyed, sitting on a soft robe opposite the elder. Tashina's gaze was not unkind, but it was heavy searching. "The man who is your father, Tashina," began, her voice a near whisper. "He speaks of honor with a forked tongue. He came to us a year ago, speaking of peace. We made a treaty. We gave him the right to build his road through the lowlands. In return, he promised no soldier would set foot in our sacred hills, the hills where our ancestors sleep." She paused, her eyes seeming to look through Lydia into the past. "Our warriors kept the peace, but his did not. His men came into the hills. They said they were hunting. They were not hunting animals. They were hunting the yellow spirit stone that sleeps in our sacred ground. Gold." The word hung in the air, cold and greedy. "My husband went to speak with him," Tashina continued. "To show him the treaty paper, to remind him of his word. Your father tore the paper. He called my husband a liar and put him in chains." Lydia felt a wave of nausea. This was not the story she knew. Her father had told her the chief had raided their supply lines, that he was a dangerous renegade. As if reading her mind, Tashina reached into a decorated leather case and pulled out 2 pieces of rolled parchment. She unrolled them side by side. "He is a clever man, your father," she said quietly. "He made 2 papers." Lydia leaned forward. The first was a beautifully scripted document in English. It detailed land rights, trade agreements, and at the bottom, the elegant looping signature of Colonel Lydia Archer. Beside it was the thumbprint of the chief stained in blue ink. The second document was a crude forgery. The terms were different, harsher, giving the army full access to the hills. The colonel's signature was the same, but the chief's mark, it was a clumsy black smear, nothing like the clear print on the first. A lie. A provable, damning lie. Her father's honor was a sham. His civilization was a mask for theft. Her entire life, the order and safety of the fort, it was all built on this rotten foundation. The wall he had built to hold back the chaos was a lie. He was the chaos. She was returned to her teepee. Her mind a whirlwind of shame and horror. She was not just a hostage. She was the daughter of the villain in this story. Honiahaka entered her teepee moments later, his shadow falling over her. His face was set impassive, likely expecting to see her defiant or pleading. He found her on her knees, the two phantom documents burning in her mind's eye. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw no fear in her gaze, only a shared broken sorrow. "He lied," she whispered, her voice cracking. The confession was a surrender, a plea and an accusation all at once. "My father, he lied to all of us." Honiahaka stared down at her, the stony mask of the warrior faltering. The wall of hatred between them, so high and so thick just hours before, crumbled into dust. The confession, a whispered bridge of shame between them, settled in the teepee's dusty air. In the space of a heartbeat, Lydia was no longer a captive, and Honiahaka was no longer a guard. They were two survivors adrift on the same sea of lies, their enmity dissolved by a shared terrible truth. The quiet that followed was fragile, a thin pane of glass, waiting for the world's violence to shatter it. It did not have to wait long. A shout sharp and ragged tore through the fabric of the evening. A village scout, his face slick with sweat and his eyes wide with terror, stumbled toward the council fire. "They come!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "The blue coats, I saw their banners in the North Pass. They march with the setting sun." A wave of panicked motion rippled through the village. Warriors grabbed for weapons, mothers pulled children into their lodges. The air, moments before filled with a tense but ordered quiet, was now thick with the metallic taste of imminent battle. Lydia felt her blood run cold. Her father. He was not a man of patience or negotiation. He was a man of swift, brutal solutions. He was coming to erase his mistake. Before the elders could form a plan, a second, more intimate threat materialized. Moto, the hawk-faced warrior whose rage had simmered since the ultimatum, strode toward her teepee. He was a vision of righteous fury. His war club gripped tight in his fist, a dozen equally grim warriors at his back. He ripped the teepee flap aside, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire, ignoring Honiahaka and locking onto Lydia. "The spirits cry out for justice." He snarled, his words aimed at Honiahaka, but meant for all to hear. "The white woman's presence is a poison that has soured the warrior's heart and drawn the serpent to our door. Her life will be our answer to the colonel's ultimatum." He took a step forward, raising his club. Honiahaka moved not with the explosive speed of a warrior charging, but with the deliberate, immovable force of a landslide. He placed himself in the teepees, opening a wall of living flesh. He met Moto's furious gaze, his own face a mask of cold, hard granite. "You are a great warrior, Moto." Honiahaka's voice rumbled low and dangerous. "But your grief has made you blind. She is not the poison. She is the antidote." He glanced back at Lydia, a flicker of meaning passing between them. "She is the truth. Her voice can stop this war. To kill her is to kill our last hope. It is to let the liar win. She is a liar's daughter." Moto shrieked, his reason lost to rage. "She will die." He and his warriors surged forward. The debate was over. Honiahaka knew it. The village was a tinderbox, and the sparks were coming from two directions at once. To stay was to be consumed. In that split second, he made a choice that severed him from his past, from his duty as he had known it. He would not save the hostage. He would save the witness. He reached back, his hand closing around Lydia's wrist like a manacle. "Naesta," he commanded. Now he pulled her into the chaos. They were a desperate two-person tribe at war with everyone. They dodged through the panicked village, Honiahaka moving with a disorienting, powerful grace. When one of Moto's warriors blocked their path, Honiahaka didn't strike to kill. He moved like water, a disabling shove, a powerful block that sent the man sprawling, and kept moving. He was fighting his own brothers, and the pain of it was etched on his face. They broke through the last of the lodges and out into the open ground sloping up toward the cliffs. Below them, at the far end of the valley, the first line of blue-coated soldiers emerged from the trees. A bugle call, crisp and clear in the evening air, echoed off the canyon walls. It was a sound from Lydia's childhood, a sound that had meant safety-ordered dinner time. Now it was the sound of her own death sentence. "There they are," she heard an officer yell, his voice faint but clear. The savage and the girl. They were no longer in a village. They were on a killing floor. Honiahaka pulled her toward the cliffs, their only hope. "Faster," he urged, his voice a raw rasp. They scrambled up the incline, thorny branches, tearing at her skin, her lungs on fire. A shot rang out from below. A puff of dust exploded from a rock just beside her head. She screamed a thin, terrified sound. He shoved her behind a boulder. "Stay low." He peered over the rock, then pulled her along again, moving from cover to cover. They were climbing now, using a treacherous game trail that snaked its way up the cliff face. Below, the soldiers were advancing, firing sporadically. Behind, she could hear Moto's pursuit, his angry cries urging his warriors on. They were trapped, a thin layer of salvation between two rising tides of death. The trail narrowed, then ended. It simply stopped at the edge of a precipice, a sheer drop. Maybe 50-60 feet below, a river raged through a deep gorge, its water a churning, angry white in the fading light. It was the end of the world. "We can't," Lydia cried, her voice choked with tears and terror as she stared at the abyss. "There's nowhere to go." Honiahaka turned his back to the drop, his body shielding her. He was breathing hard, a long bloody scratch running down his cheek. He looked back the way they came. She could see the figures of Moto's warriors getting closer on the trail. Below, the soldiers were taking aim. "The earth has closed its hand," he said, his voice a strange, calm whisper amidst the chaos. He looked down at the violent churning water, then back at her. His eyes were wild, but they held no fear. "But the river still runs free." He was not asking. He was offering a final, insane choice. A choice between certain death at the hands of men or a chance at life in the heart of the wild. She looked from the hate-filled faces of the warriors to the cold, impersonal rifles of her father's soldiers, and then into the fierce, desperate eyes of the man who had, against all reason, chosen to save her. The girl who dreamed of maps and faraway places died in that moment. A woman she did not know took her place. She gave a single, sharp, terrified nod. His hand tightened on hers. "Close your eyes," he commanded, "and jump," and together they leaped from the cliff's edge. For a breathtaking second they were suspended between the sky and the earth, between two wars they did not start, but could not escape. Then they fell plunging into the cold, roaring, violent embrace of the river, leaving the world of men and their madness behind. The world was a roaring liquid chaos. The icy shock of the river stole Lydia's breath, a brutal thief that left her lungs aching and empty. She was a leaf in a flood, powerless, tossed and turned in the cold, dark violence of the current. The only point of reality in the entire universe was Honiahaka's hand still locked around her wrist, an iron anchor in the maelstrom. She saw his head break the surface, his face a mask of grim effort as he fought the rapids, pulling her along with him. He was not swimming. He was fighting the water, forcing his will upon it. They were dragged downstream, crashing against rocks, scraping through shallows, until the river, as if bored with its new toys, threw them onto a gravelly shore in a heap of bruised limbs and sodden clothes. For a long time they just lay there, gasping for air, the sound of their own ragged breathing a counterpoint to the river's roar. Lydia was the first to stir. Every muscle screamed, but she was alive. She looked at Honiahaka. He was lying on his back. His eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, painful-looking breaths. A long, dark gash ran down his leg, where it had met a sharp rock, and his left shoulder was twisted at an unnatural angle. He had shielded her during the fall, taking the brunt of the impact. The terror she had felt on the cliff returned, but it was a different kind of terror now. It was not for herself. "Honiahaka," she whispered, crawling to his side. "Honiahaka, can you hear me?" He groaned, a low sound of pure agony. His eyes fluttered open. "The water," he rasped. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "The water saved us." She looked at his shoulder. "But it hurt you." With a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, she got to her feet. "We have to move. Away from the riverbank." She spent the next hour dragging him, inch by painful inch, into a small, dry alcove she found in the rock face, a shallow cave hidden by a thick curtain of willows. She built a fire, her hands clumsy, but her purpose absolute. The girl who had once dreamed of escaping the fort was now building a new one, a fortress for two against the wilderness. His shoulder was dislocated. She knew from the books she'd read. She also knew what had to be done. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice a thin apology. She braced her foot against his side, took his arm in both her hands, and pulled with everything she had. He roared a sharp guttural sound of agony that echoed in the small space, and then there was a sickening wet pop as the joint slid back into place. He immediately slumped back unconscious from the pain. Good. It was better that way. She worked through the night, a silent, focused vigil. She cleaned the gash on his leg, using the last of her torn dress for a bandage. She found the herbs he would have used, their bitter scent familiar now. She kept the fire high. She was no longer a hostage or a witness. She was a guardian. He woke 2 days later. He woke to the smell of roasting fish and the sight of Lydia sitting quietly sharpening his knife with a smooth river stone. She had kept them alive. He said nothing for a long time, simply watching her. The silence was thick with unspoken things. Finally, he sat up, wincing. "The hunter has become the hunted," he said, his voice hoarse. He touched his bandaged shoulder. "And the prey has learned to bite." Lydia stopped her work. "You would have done the same for me." It was not a question. That evening, as she was redressing the wound on his leg, her fingers brushed against an old faded scar on his calf, a circular pattern, almost like a brand. "This one," she asked softly. "Was it?" From the soldiers, he looked down, a flicker of a distant memory in his eyes. "No," he said. "This was from a boy's foolishness. A test of bravery. We held hot stones to prove we could bear pain without crying out." He shook his head slightly. "A boy's idea of strength. I have learned since that true strength is not in enduring pain but in healing it." His eyes met hers, and the meaning was clear. His vulnerability opened a door. "My father," Lydia began, the words tasting like poison. "He used to say that scars were a sign of weakness, a sign that order had failed. Your father sees the world as a map to be conquered," Honiahaka said, his voice gentle. "My people see it as a story to be read. Scars are merely the words. They tell of where we have been. They do not decide where we are going." He looked at her, at the haunted look that still lingered in her eyes. "You have scars, Lydia. Not on your skin, but deeper. I see them." A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back slid down her cheek. "At the fort, my only battles were with a needle and thread. My life was a perfect, empty page. I thought I wanted freedom. I didn't know what it meant." "Freedom is a heavy burden," he said quietly. "It is the freedom to starve, the freedom to be hunted." He paused. "And the freedom to choose your tribe." They sat in the warm glow of the fire, the river whispering outside. A treaty had been made, not of land or of nations, but of shared wounds. An unspoken pact between two survivors who had found in each other the one thing the world had taken from them, a home. A week passed. Honiahaka's strength returned. They began to scout their surroundings, moving with the practiced ease of partners. From a high ridge one afternoon, they looked out over the vast expanse, and they saw them. Far to the east, a column was moving, a small formal procession glittering in the sun. It flew a banner Lydia didn't recognize, a general's escort, she realized. They were too far away to be a threat. But then Honiahaka touched her arm. His body tense. He pointed to the west. Another group of soldiers, her father's men. They were not marching. They were moving stealthily through the hills, taking up positions. Ambush positions. They were setting a trap along the very trail the general's column was taking. Lydia's blood ran cold. The pieces crashed together in her mind with horrifying clarity. Her father wasn't just a thief. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a traitor. He was going to assassinate a general, blame it on the savages, and plunge the entire territory into a war that would burn away all evidence of his crimes. The stakes had just escalated from their own survival to the fate of the entire frontier, and they were the only two people in the world who knew. The world for a long moment was nothing but the two columns of soldiers moving toward a fate they could not see. One marched toward an ambush. The other crept into position to spring it. Between them on a high, lonely ridge stood the only two people on earth who knew the truth. Lydia's breath hitched. A war. Her father would start a war to hide the stain of his greed. He would sacrifice a general, his own men, and an entire people, all for the yellow stone that slept in the earth. The sheer scale of his evil was a physical weight threatening to crush her. Beside her, Honiahaka was utterly still, his eyes fixed on the scene below. He had seen this story before. He knew how it ended, with fire and blood and lies that would be written into history books. "We have to stop them," Lydia said, the words a raw whisper that was nearly stolen by the wind. "We have to." Honiahaka looked at her. He saw not the frightened girl from the fort, but a woman whose eyes burned with the same fire he had seen in the eyes of his own people's fiercest protectors. He gave a single sharp nod. Their personal journey for survival was over. A new, more desperate race had begun. They rode with a reckless speed, not away from danger, but directly into its heart. They pushed their stolen horse through treacherous terrain, using the knowledge Honiahaka possessed to cut across the land to get ahead of both marching columns. They had to reach the ambush point first. It was a narrow pass, a natural choke point known as the Devil's Jaw. They arrived with perhaps an hour to spare. The trap was set. From their vantage point, they could see her father's sharpshooters hidden in the rocks, a silent, patient line of death waiting for the general's arrival. "We cannot just ride down there," Honiahaka said, his voice low. "They will shoot us before we speak a word." "No," Lydia agreed, her mind racing, piecing together the military tactics she had overheard her entire life. "The general is a cautious man. He will send scouts ahead, and he will not enter a pass like this if there is a sign of danger." Her eyes scanned the steep canyon walls above the pass, like a rock slide. It was the same desperate gambit that had saved them before. They worked frantically, dislodging key stones at the top of the unstable slope, creating a deadfall that would block the entrance to the pass. They finished just as the sound of the general's approaching column reached them. They hid, their hearts pounding in unison. The general's 2 scouts rode into view, their blue uniforms stark against the red rock. Just as they neared the entrance, Honiahaka sent a single large boulder crashing down. It was enough. The scouts reared their horses back, eyes wide, and galloped back to the main column. The entire procession halted. Minutes later, the general himself appeared, flanked by his officers, his face a mask of stern inquiry. At the same time, from the rocks above, Colonel Archer emerged, his face livid with fury that his trap had been sprung prematurely. General Archer shouted, "It's an ambush. The savages are in the rocks." This was the moment. Lydia stepped from their hiding place into the open. She was a small, ragged figure, her dress torn, her hair wild. But she stood tall. Lydia. Her father roared, his face a mixture of shock and pure rage. "What is the meaning of this? The renegade has addled your mind." "She is no renegade, Colonel," a new voice said. Honiahaka stepped out to stand beside Lydia. His presence immense, his dignity unshakable. He was not holding a weapon. The general stared, his hand on his pistol. "In God's name, who are you people?" "I am Lydia Archer, sir," she said, her voice clear and ringing with no trace of a tremor. "Daughter of Colonel Archer. And this is Honiahaka, son of the chief your colonel has illegally imprisoned." "Lies," Archer bellowed. "She's been with the savage for weeks. He's turned her against her own no father." Lydia said, her gaze locking with his. The coldness in her eyes made him flinch. "I am not against my own. I am against you." She turned to the general. "Sir, my father has broken a sacred treaty. He has done so to steal gold from this land. The men who attacked my family's wagon were not this tribe. They were bandits my father hired to create a pretense for his actions." She held out the worn, folded treaty papers she had taken from Tashina. "And he planned to have you and your men assassinated here today to blame them and to start a war to cover his crimes." The truth, stark and simple, hung in the silent air. The general looked from Lydia's fierce, honest face to the noble bearing of the warrior beside her, and then to the sputtering, wild-eyed rage of Colonel Archer. He saw the truth. "Colonel Archer," the general said, his voice deadly calm, "you are relieved of your command. You will be placed under arrest." Archer's face contorted. With a desperate snarl, he drew his own pistol, aiming it not at the general but at Lydia, at the daughter who had undone him. He never fired. Honiahaka moved faster than a striking snake, a single powerful blow sending the colonel's pistol flying. The other soldiers loyal to the general's authority converged at once, and her father was swallowed by a sea of blue coats, his curses and screams fading as they dragged him away. Justice swift and absolute had been delivered. Later, after the dust had settled, General Harris approached them. "Miss Archer," he said, his voice holding a new respect, "your bravery has prevented a terrible injustice. I will see to it that the treaty is honored and the chief is released. I can offer you a place in my escort back to Fort Laramie. You will be safe." Lydia looked at the soldiers, at the world of walls and uniforms that had once been her own. It felt like a lifetime ago. Then she looked at Honiahaka, who stood silently, leaving the choice to her. She saw her future. "Thank you, General," she said, her voice polite but firm. "But I believe I am already safe." She took a step closer to Honiahaka's side. "My place is here." The general looked between the colonel's daughter and the Cheyenne warrior, and for the first time that day, he smiled a brief, knowing smile. He nodded, turned, and left them. Lydia and Honiahaka stood together on the ridge, watching the soldiers depart. The sun was beginning to set, bathing the lands of the Cheyenne in a soft golden light. They looked out not at an ending, but at a beginning. Their future was an unwritten map, a territory vast and unknown, but they would explore it together, a tribe of two, bound by a treaty of scars and the promise of a new dawn.